Hi, this is Thinkbomb number 2, What is Philosophy? And I'm Professor Bryan Van Norden. Now, I'm a professor of philosophy, so you think I'd be able to define what philosophy is and what philosophers are. But it's a little harder than it seems at first. Let's start with the word. So our word philosophy comes from a Greek word, philosophia, which was coined by Plato. Philosophia literally means love of wisdom, and so a philosopher is a lover of wisdom. But what does that mean? Plato wanted the term philosopher to contrast with a term sophos for someone who claims to be wise. So a philosopher is someone who loves and seeks wisdom, but doesn't necessarily claim to have it, whereas a sophist, someone who practices sophistry, is somebody who dogmatically claims to have knowledge, but maybe doesn't actually have it. Now, what do philosophers study, and what is the field of philosophy about? You might know that the most advanced degree in most fields is a PhD. And a PhD stands for Philosophiae Doctor, meaning simply Doctor of Philosophy. And that's true whether you're getting a doctorate in chemistry or physics or biology or psychology or economics. Why is that? Because we don't count those things as philosophy today. Well, in the old medieval universities, you could get an advanced degree in medicine if you wanted to become a physician, law if you wanted to become a lawyer, theology if you were going to become a monk, and then everything else was philosophy. And eventually they developed an advanced degree, a PhD in philosophy, and that just covered everything else. So historically, if you want to know what philosophers study and what they do, the answer is philosophers study and research and write about everything that isn't theology or medicine or law. So philosophers were the first physicists, they were the first biologists, they were the first mathematicians. Now, this began to change with the rise of the modern era and with the rise of modern science. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the early modern scientists, people like Galileo and Newton, they thought of themselves as philosophers. If you told Galileo or Newton that they were not a philosopher, that they were a scientist instead of a philosopher, they either wouldn't understand what you were saying or they'd be offended. Of course I'm a philosopher, Newton would tell you. But gradually what happened over time is that the fields of physics and biology and chemistry and then later psychology and later economics spun off as separate disciplines. And so philosophers were left with what's left over. Well, what is left over when you take away modern physics and modern biology and modern mathematics and all those other things? Here's one way you could conceptualize what philosophers do today. You could say that philosophy is dialogue about problems that we agree are important, but we don't agree about the right method for solving them. So fields like physics and biology, there's broad agreement about the right method for resolving disagreements and finding answers. That doesn't mean that there's never any disagreement. It doesn't mean that there's not many things that we don't know, because of course there are. But by and large, physicists agree about how you go about resolving a disagreement in physics. Mathematicians agree, for the most part, about what a good proof in mathematics looks like. So in philosophy today, we study problems that we as a culture agree are important, but we don't yet know the right method for solving. When we figure out what the right method is for solving these problems, they get spun off into separate fields. And again, it's important to remember historically that the philosophers are the ones who figured out the right method for doing natural science. The philosophers are the ones who came up with the physics and the biology as we understand it today. But now those have become separate disciplines, and we contemporary philosophers are left with the important but methodologically unsolved problems. Now, where did I get this definition from? Well, this guy wrote a book in which he offered this definition. So yeah, this is my definition. Not every philosopher is going to quote this definition, But my experience has been that lots of other philosophers, even if they wouldn't phrase it the way I do, would broadly agree that in philosophy, we're dealing with problems that we think are important, we're engaging in rational dialogue about them, and we don't yet agree about the right methodology for solving them. Once we agree about the right methodology for solving them, those problems become parts of other distinct disciplines. So, what cultures do we find philosophy in? Well, we all know that we find philosophy in the Anglo-European tradition, the tradition that goes back to people like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But if we actually look at other intellectual traditions, we find that people are doing philosophy in those traditions as well. For example, there's the tradition of Africana philosophy. And notice I say Africana, not African philosophy, because the term Africana philosophy is broader. It includes not just philosophy done by people living in or born in Africa, like the great Zara Jacob, and contemporary philosophers like Kwasi Wiredu and Kwame Anthony Appiah. Africana philosophy also includes what's sometimes called the philosophy of the African diaspora. So the philosophy done by people of African descent whose ancestors left, willingly or unwillingly, Africa. So Africana philosophy also includes the philosophy of thinkers like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Cornel West. Now, as I was saying, of course, we know there's philosophy in the Anglo-European tradition. Socrates isn't the first philosopher in the Anglo-European tradition, but he's one of the most influential. He knew and taught this young guy Plato, who started his own philosophical academy, and he had a great student who's named Aristotle. And in the Anglo-European tradition, the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic faiths all use the philosophy of people like Plato and Aristotle to interpret their sacred scriptures. And sometimes we talk about Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy under the rubric Abrahamic philosophy, because for all their differences, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers agree that Abraham was a great prophet. And all these Abrahamic philosophers, including Christians like Augustine and Aquinas, Jews like Maimonides, Islamic philosophers like Averroes and Avicenna, they were all deeply influenced by and great admirers of the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, and they used that to interpret their own sacred text. And the influence of pagan philosophy on Christian, Jewish, and Islamic thought continues to the present day, even among people who may not realize that there is such an influence. Now, again, if you actually bother to look at these traditions, you'll discover there's also an indigenous American philosophical tradition. They're the great ancient civilizations of the indigenous Americas that were not influenced originally by European or other kinds of philosophy like the Mayans and the Aztecs. There are contemporary indigenous American communities. Hopi thought has been studied very carefully by philosophers, and there's a lot of great work on it, just as one example. There are also a handful of active contemporary indigenous American philosophers, including Ann Waters, who I believe was the first indigenous American woman to be awarded a PhD in philosophy, and Kyle White, who's a currently active philosopher working especially on issues of environmental ethics related to indigenous American thought. Now, I'm a specialist, among other things, in East Asian philosophy, the philosophy of China, the Koreas, Japan, and also Vietnam, which, although we often classify Vietnam as part of Southeast Asia, it was deeply influenced by East Asian philosophy. And there's a lot of philosophical movements in East Asia. Obviously, Confucianism, going back to Confucius or Kungzi himself and his later followers like Mengzi, Taoist philosophy. Many people have heard of Lao Tzu, the supposed author of the Tao Te Ching, but an equally great Taoist philosopher is Zhuangzi. Then you have later Neo-Confucian philosophers like Jushi and Wang Yangming. In Japan, there's the Kyoto school. Korea has an active philosophical tradition. Itage is one of the great philosophers there. And there's also a very active philosophical tradition in South Asia, including India, but also other countries in South Asia were the home to traditional philosophy in this area. Buddhism is one of the most influential schools that originally developed in South Asia and then later spread out to Southeast Asia and East Asia. Nagarjuna and Shantideva are two of the greatest later Buddhist philosophers. There's also so-called orthodox philosophy in South Asia, like Vedantic philosophers such as Shankara and Ramanuja. Nyaya philosophy is also fascinating, and Vatsyayana is one of the great Nyaya philosophers. So if you actually bother to look at any of these traditions, you'll find that people are engaging in dialogue on important but methodologically unsolved problems, and they're often giving answers which are recognizably philosophical, answers to recognizable philosophical problems, and often saying things that are different enough to be interesting, but similar enough to philosophical questions we recognize to clearly be philosophy. Sometimes people just dismiss philosophy outside the Anglo-European tradition, but if you actually bother to look, you find there really is philosophy in these traditions. Now, I've been saying that philosophy is about important but unsolved, methodologically unsolved problems. What would be an example of what that would look like? Well, let's think about an example. I don't know if people still use Venn diagrams in teaching, but let's imagine this rectangle represents everything there is in the universe is somewhere in this rectangle, okay? Then let this circle represent everything that we're capable of knowing about with natural science, however you conceptualize natural science. Some people think that physics is like the master science and that ultimately chemistry and biology can be reduced to physics. Some people think that they're really fundamentally separate, but however you conceptualize it, let this circle represent everything in the universe that in principle we could learn about from natural science. Now, a natural question to ask is there anything in the universe, the rectangular universe of discourse, that's not in that circle? Or is everything in the universe that we could in principle know about, is everything there is to know covered by natural science? Or are there some things that exist that can't be known by natural science? Well, many smart people are physicalists. And oversimplifying a little bit, a physicalist thinks that physics tells us everything there is to know about the universe. Everything that could be known is something that physics could know about. That's what a physicalist thinks. So there's nothing outside this circle, according to the physicalist. But here's a paradox. If you think physicalism is true, how do you know that? You can't use physics to tell you whether physicalism is true, because by definition, physics or the other natural sciences can only tell you the things that are inside that inner circle. If you want to determine that there's nothing outside the circle, you have to, metaphorically speaking, step outside the circle of natural science and look and see whether there's anything outside it. But you can't, in principle, do that with natural science, because natural science can only tell you about the things that are its appropriate topic. By definition, it can't tell you whether there's anything outside its own sphere of inquiry. So who's the person who investigates the issue of whether or not there's anything in the universe outside of physics? That's what the philosopher does. So ironically, physicalism cannot be shown to be true from within physics, but that shows that there'll always be some questions which are purely philosophical. Even if the answer you choose to give is, no, I don't think there's anything outside of natural science, that statement itself is not a natural scientific question, because you can't use the methodology of natural science to prove that there's nothing that can't be studied with the methodology of natural science. So that's why I think there always will be room for philosophy. Other questions that philosophers study include issues in ethics. What's the right way to live? What are the right actions to perform? Is there anything we absolutely should never do, regardless of the consequences? Or should we do whatever has the best consequences? Is there a God who stands outside the physical universe, or is there not? What is the fundamental structure of the universe? Is there just mass, energy, and space time, or is there anything beyond that? These are all philosophical questions, and they're questions that any thinking person should be concerned with. So thank you so much for listening. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and comment. And I look forward to talking to you again on our next video.